My name is Nathan, and I never expected my life to change so dramatically during my junior year of college. As a 21-year-old psychology major, I thought I had everything figured out, including keeping my sexuality private while sharing a dorm room with Eric, my straight roommate. Eric was a business major with athletic build from his years of swimming. We'd been randomly assigned as roommates at the start of the semester, and while we were cordial, we mostly kept to ourselves. He was the classic all-American type, blonde hair, bright smile, and seemingly endless confidence. Meanwhile, I was more reserved, focusing on my studies and small circle of friends. Our dynamic shifted one rainy October evening. I had just finished a long study session at the library when I returned to find Eric sitting on his bed, clearly troubled. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting down my backpack. He looked up, attempting a weak smile. "Jessica and I broke up," he said quietly. 3 years, just done. I sat on my bed across from him, unsure what to say. In all our months as roommates, we'd never had a genuinely personal conversation. "I'm sorry to hear that. Do you want to talk about it?" That simple question opened a floodgate. For the next 2 hours, Eric shared everything: how they'd grown apart, how she'd accused him of being emotionally distant, how he felt lost. I listened, offered perspective when asked, and slowly saw a different side of my roommate emerge. From that night forward, something changed between us. We started having real conversations, sharing meals at the dining hall, and even studying together. I found myself growing increasingly drawn to his genuine nature, his unexpected vulnerability, and the way he'd scrunch his nose when concentrating on difficult problems. Of course, these developing feelings terrified me. Not only was Eric straight, but he was also my roommate. The last thing I needed was to complicate our living situation with unrequited emotions. As November approached, our friendship continued to deepen. We developed a comfortable routine: morning coffee runs before classes, workout sessions at the campus gym, though I mostly pretended to know what I was doing while stealing glances at him, and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. One particularly cold evening, after returning from a grueling swim practice, Eric caught a nasty cold. I found myself instinctively taking care of him, bringing him soup from the dining hall, checking his temperature, and making sure he took his medicine. While he was half asleep, fever-clouded, he grabbed my hand and mumbled, "You're too good to me, Nate." The casual intimacy of that moment sent my heart racing. I gently withdrew my hand, telling myself not to read too much into it. But that night, lying in my bed across the room, listening to his congested breathing, I realized how deep I'd fallen. The turning point came during finals week. We were both stressed, running on caffeine and minimal sleep. I was in the shared bathroom, trying to calm down after a panic attack about my upcoming exams, when Eric walked in. He took one look at my tear-streaked face and, without hesitation, pulled me into a hug. "Hey, breathe with me," he said softly, his chest rising and falling against mine. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." We stood there for what felt like forever, my face pressed against his shoulder, his hand making small circles on my back. I could smell his familiar scent, a mix of chlorine from the pool and his cedar body wash. When we finally pulled apart, there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where our faces were inches apart, and I could have sworn his eyes dropped to my lips. But then someone knocked on the bathroom door, shattering the moment. We jumped apart like we'd been shocked, and Eric cleared his throat awkwardly before leaving. The next few days were strange. We didn't talk about what happened in the bathroom, but something had shifted. I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. He started finding excuses for physical contact. A hand on my shoulder, our knees touching when we studied on his bed, sitting closer than necessary when we watched movies on his laptop. The winter break loomed ahead of us, and the thought of not seeing Eric for 3 weeks made my stomach churn. The night before we were set to leave campus, we decided to have an impromptu roommate celebration in our dorm. We ordered pizza, played video games, and somehow ended up sitting on the floor, sharing stories from our childhoods. "You know," Eric said, his voice slightly hesitant, "I've never told anyone this, but sometimes I think about." He paused, taking a long sip from his soda. Never mind. No, what is it? I pressed, my heart racing at his unusual vulnerability. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with an intensity that made my breath catch. I think about how different things might have been if I'd met you before Jessica. The air in the room suddenly felt thick. What do you mean? I don't know, Nate. That's the problem. I don't know what I mean. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as a sign of frustration. Ever since that night in the bathroom, I can't stop thinking about things. My mouth went dry. Things? About you. About us. About how you make me feel more myself than anyone else ever has. He moved closer, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. I've never, with a guy. I never thought I would. Eric, I said softly, you don't have to figure everything out right now. But I want to, he whispered, and then his hand was on my cheek, and everything I'd been holding back for months threatened to spill over. Are you sure? I managed to ask, even as I leaned into his touch. Instead of answering, he kissed me. It was tentative at first, almost questioning, but when I responded, it deepened into something more urgent, more certain. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted, resting his forehead against mine. The winter break that followed was both wonderful and torturous. We texted constantly, had long late-night phone calls, and even managed to meet halfway between our hometowns for a day trip. Eric was still processing his feelings, still trying to understand this new part of himself, but he was certain about one thing. He wanted to be with me. Returning to campus after winter break felt like stepping into a new world. Everything looked the same, our cramped dorm room, the familiar hallways, the shared bathroom, but everything was different. We were different. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of figuring out what we were to each other. In public, we maintained our close friendship facade, but behind closed doors, we were exploring this new intimacy between us. Eric was still hesitant about public displays of affection, and I understood. Coming to terms with your sexuality is a deeply personal journey, and I didn't want to rush him. One evening after Eric's swim practice, we were studying on his bed when he suddenly closed his textbook. I want to tell the team, he said, his voice firm but his hands slightly shaking. Are you sure? I asked, surprised. The swim team was like his second family, and I knew how much their opinion meant to him. He nodded. I'm tired of hiding who I am, who we are. Besides, he smiled, taking my hand, Coach Martinez's daughter just came out last month, and he couldn't have been more supportive. The next week was tense. Eric came out to his teammates during a team meeting. Most were supportive, some were confused, and a few were awkwardly silent. His best friend on the team, Tom, clapped him on the back and said, Dude, we got figured. The way you look at Nathan isn't exactly subtle. That evening, Eric returned to our room with tears in his eyes, but they were tears of relief. He pulled me into a fierce hug, and I could feel years of tension leaving his body. They accept me, he whispered against my neck. They accept us. Our relationship deepened after that. Eric became more comfortable with public affection, holding my hand on campus, sitting close to me in the library, even kissing me goodbye before classes. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. We had our arguments, usually about Eric's intensive swimming schedule or my tendency to withdraw when stressed about exams. One particular fight stands out in my memory. It was during midterms, and I had been avoiding Eric, burying myself in studies. He confronted me in our room one night, hurt evident in his voice. You can't just shut me out when things get tough, he said. I'm not just your roommate anymore, Nate. I'm your partner. That word, partner, hit me hard. We hadn't really put labels on what we were, and hearing him say it made everything feel more real, more serious. That night marked a turning point in our relationship. After our argument, we sat down and really talked about our fears and expectations. Eric admitted he was terrified of failing to balance swimming, academics, and our relationship. I confessed my deep-seated fear that he would eventually realize this was just a phase and leave me for a woman. That's not going to happen, he said firmly, taking both my hands in his. This isn't a phase, Nate. What I feel for you is more real than anything I've ever felt before. As spring semester progressed, we fell into a rhythm. I started attending his swim meets, cheering from the stands as he cut through the water with powerful strokes. He began joining my study groups, bringing coffee and snacks during our late-night sessions. We became known around campus as that couple, the swimmer and the psychology major who somehow made it work. One weekend in April, Eric's parents came to visit. He had come out to them over spring break. His mother had been immediately supportive, while his father needed more time to process. When they arrived, I was nervous wreck, but Eric's mom hugged me immediately. "Thank you for making my son so happy," she whispered in my ear. His father was more reserved, but polite. During dinner, watching Eric animatedly tell stories about us, his father's expression softened. Later, he pulled me aside and said, "I may not understand everything, but I can see how much you care for each other. That's what matters." The semester was nearing its end when another challenge arose. Eric was offered a prestigious swimming internship for the summer in California. We'd be on opposite coasts for 3 months. "I don't have to take it," he said one night as we lay in his narrow bed, my head on his chest. "Yes, you do," I replied, though my heart ached at the thought of the distance. "This is your dream. You're my dream too," he said softly, and I felt my eyes well up with tears. We spent those final weeks before summer making plans for video calls, planning visits, and creating a shared digital calendar. The night before he left for California, we couldn't sleep. Instead, we sat on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., where our story had really begun, talking about everything and nothing. That summer taught us both about strength and commitment. The time difference made communication challenging, but we made it work. Every morning, I woke up to a good morning text from Eric, usually accompanied by a poolside selfie. Every night, we video called, sharing our days despite the physical distance. I flew out to visit him in July. Watching him in his element, coaching young swimmers, training with Olympic hopefuls, I fell even deeper in love. One evening, as we walked along the California beach at sunset, he stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Move in with me," he said. "Next semester, off campus." "What?" I was caught off guard. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he continued. Our dorm room was where we fell in love, but I want to start building our future together. For real. When we returned for our senior year, we moved into a small apartment near campus. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom that barely fit both of us, but it was ours. We decorated it together, arguing good-naturedly about color schemes and furniture placement. Eric insisted on hanging his swimming medals in the living room, while I covered one wall with psychology-themed artwork. Our bathroom became a special place for us, not just because of our history, but because it was where we shared quiet moments getting ready in the morning, where Eric would sing off-key in the shower, where I'd trim his hair before important meets. It was where we'd sometimes catch each other's eyes in the mirror and smile, remembering that pivotal moment during finals week a year ago. As graduation approached, we faced new decisions. Eric had received offers from several swimming programs, and I was considering graduate schools. The prospect of another long-distance period loomed over us. But this time, we approached it differently. We sat down with a map, our offers spread out before us, and looked for overlapping opportunities. It took compromise from both sides, but we found a city where he could train with a competitive team while I could pursue my master's in psychology. On our last night in the apartment, we recreated our first roommate celebration: pizza, video games, and sitting on the floor sharing stories. But this time, when Eric looked at me, there was no hesitation, no confusion, just certainty and love. "You know," he said, echoing his words from that night over a year ago, "I think about how different things might have been if I hadn't met you." "Oh," I smiled, knowing where this was going. "Yeah," he grinned. "I wouldn't be nearly as happy." Looking back now, I realize that love stories don't always follow the path we expect. Sometimes they start in shared dorm rooms and bathroom conversations. Sometimes they involve swimming pools and psychology textbooks. And sometimes they're about two people who help each other grow into who they're meant to be. Eric and I aren't perfect. We still argue about his early morning swimming routine and my tendency to overanalyze everything. But every day, I'm grateful for that rainy October evening when my straight roommate needed someone to talk to, and I was there to listen. Because sometimes The best love stories aren't about love at first sight. They're about friendship that grows, understanding that deepens, and two people who find home in each other, one shared moment at a time.